Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. In case you're new here, my name's Jennifer, and today I want to talk a little bit about the fall garden. Today was one of those days where when you go outside, you know it's still summer. My family and I actually spent the day at the lake today. But even though it's summer, there's still a lot of sunshine. The air has that little bit of a feeling of fall in it. The breeze is a little cooler, the sun isn't quite as strong, and as much as it's hard, at least for me, to really let go of summer, just of the warmth and the sunshine and just the freedom of summer, it is really time to start thinking about fall. Now, it's the middle of August, summer is definitely winding down, and if you want to have a fall garden, you definitely have to be thinking a little bit ahead. You know, plants take a little bit of time to grow, and the goal of a fall garden is to have your harvest already ready when the weather gets cool enough and the daylight gets short enough that your plants aren't really going to grow very much. So today's video is just going to be a quick kind of walk around the garden type of video. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the plants that I have growing for the fall garden, and I'm going to talk about just a couple of things you want to keep in mind when you're planning and planting your fall garden. Now along this fence here, you can see I've got some snap peas growing. These are not growing with the same vigor that they did in the spring, but they are still growing. Now, I'm not really the person to go to when it comes to getting advice about fall planted peas. I am very rarely successful with peas in the fall, but I always order a few extra seeds every spring. Even if I don't plan ahead, I usually pretty much always have some leftover seeds, so I can go ahead and plant those. It doesn't cost me anything to plant them. But despite that, I don't usually get that much of a harvest from my fall peas. Now, I don't know if that's just something that I'm doing wrong or if that is area dependent, because a lot of people say that they actually have better success with peas planted in the fall as opposed to planted in the spring. Because peas prefer to grow in cooler weather, they make an ideal crop for the fall garden. You know, as when you plant them in the summer, the soil is nice and warm. It helps the pea seeds germinate much more quickly than they do when you plant your peas in early spring. And then as they grow, the weather's kind of cooling down. So that, in theory, should make peas an ideal fall gardening crop. Peas can also handle a light frost. So all that is kind of my long-winded way of saying that these peas are a bit of an experiment for me. So feel free to follow along, and I will definitely update you guys on how these fall peas do. Hopefully we do get a yield from them. Now here you can see I have a wild and unruly patch of tomatoes. Now most people don't think of tomato plants as being part of the fall garden for a pretty good reason, and that is that tomato plants cannot survive frost. So once the frost comes, these tomato plants will be done. Basically, my goal in growing these tomatoes is to try to bring them to harvest, to be able to harvest the ripe fruit before the first frost comes. So I planted these a little bit later than I meant to. I'm kind of hoping for a late frost. Most likely I will get to harvest at least a small yield from these tomatoes, unless of course we get an early frost. Most likely I will be able to get some yield. But the size of the yield that I'll be able to get really depends on how late the frost comes and just how early my tomatoes yield. Now, if you're planting a second crop of tomatoes, you do most likely want to choose an early maturing variety. Ideally, I would have chosen an earlier maturing variety than this, but this is still fairly early. I also chose determinate tomatoes because those are more likely to yield pretty much their entire crop all at once, as opposed to an indeterminate tomato, which yields a couple tomatoes here and there as the season goes on. The harvest season is much more extended, and a lot of times you do get a larger harvest overall with an indeterminate tomato. But when you're planting something that you are hoping to be able to harvest from right before fall, you want to plant something that's going to give you all the yield all at once. So over here I've planted some indeterminate Roma tomatoes, and I'm hoping to get enough yield from those to be able to make and freeze a few batches of roasted tomato soup. So as I said, these are kind of an unconventional part of the fall garden because they won't survive a frost, but I am growing them in hopes of a second yield. So here, if you can even see this on the camera, is a little tiny sprout that is part of a little more of my conventional fall garden. I don't know if you can even see, there's another little sprout over there. So this bed right here is where I grew my summer broccoli. Now that the summer broccoli is done and has been harvested, I want to repurpose this bed here to use for fall crops. So I did come out here and I planted I direct sowed some seeds for both kale and cabbage. Those are both more traditional fall crops in that they can both survive a frost. Unlike the tomatoes that I showed you, these plants will keep going through a fairly significant frost. And in addition to their natural cold hardiness, you can see that I have these plastic hoops installed on this bed here. When it gets really cold, I can cover these with clear plastic, and that should insulate them from the coldest weather. Now, one caveat here is that you saw those little sprouts. You know that I direct sowed my seeds right into the ground here. Normally when I am planting plants like that for fall, I do like to start them inside or at least in little pots on my deck so that I'm transplanting out seedlings. I was a little bit behind this year, and eventually it got to the point where if I did not just put seeds in the ground, it probably wasn't going to get done, at least not on time. So I did plant some seeds out here. We're gonna hope for the best, hope again for a nice long fall, and we will see what happens here. So I'll definitely, again, this is another kind of experiment that I'll keep you guys updated on, but I'm hoping we get a nice long gentle fall, that my seeds take root here, and that we get to harvest lots of kale and cabbage this fall. So in this bed back here, you can see I have this covered with insect netting. I planted some broccoli plants back here. You can see that these I did in fact transplant. So the broccoli seedlings in the bed behind me, I did actually start those in small pots out in the garden and transplant them out here. That's more the way that I usually like to grow my fall brassicas. So those may have a little bit better of a chance. We'll see what happens there. I did start them slightly later than was ideal. So my fall garden this year is going to kind of be a little bit of a toss-up as to how successful it's going to be. But again, if I didn't try, I would be guaranteed no harvest. So at least this way, I have a chance of something at least. So this bed here, you can see it's got kind of a hodgepodge mess right now. This is where I grew all my spring lettuces and greens. In all these bare spots here, I came out and re-sowed lots of lettuce seeds. There isn't any germination yet because I just planted them a couple days ago. So I'm hoping for a nice abundant crop of lettuce and greens in this bed here. Over in the side yard garden, this raised bed here has a little bit of everything and a good example of the different variety of crops you can grow in a fall garden. Now in the fall garden, as we've been talking about kind of throughout this video, you can grow plants that have a short maturity date that you're hoping to harvest before the frost, and you can also grow plants that will live beyond the frost. We have some of both going on in this garden here. Now you can see all these beans here. These are bush beans. Despite the fact that they are wrapping around each other and trying to climb, those are bush beans. Those have a very short maturity date. So bush beans are a great crop to succession sow. Once you get your first harvest, depending on your area and when your first frost day is, a lot of times you will have time to get a second harvest of beans before you get a frost. Beans are very frost sensitive, which means that in order to get a harvest from these beans, I need to make sure that I have enough time to harvest before my first frost, which I should. As you can see, these beans have grown pretty well already. We still have almost 2 months before, or maybe even 2 months before our first frost. So I'm pretty much guaranteed to get at least somewhat of a harvest from these beans. Next to the beans here, I also have a couple zucchinis, and that's the same thing. These are very frost sensitive, but they're very quick maturing. So I most likely will be able to get a harvest from both of these zucchinis before the frost comes. Now over here are tomato plants. These again are frost sensitive. These I really don't know if I'm going to have time to get a harvest from or not. So ever since the beginning of the tomato season, I had been planning to try to get a second crop of tomatoes for fall. Basically what I did was when I pruned off some of the suckers on my mature tomato plants, I rooted some of these in water and then planted them out here in this bed. Basically I cloned my existing plants, and that saves me a lot of time as opposed to starting plants from seed. These plants already have a head start. Now, that being said, tomatoes are a much slower maturing crop than either bush beans or zucchini, so I don't know if I will be able to get a harvest from these tomatoes, but it's definitely worth a try, and we'll see what happens with that. Now, admittedly, these tiny lettuce seedlings do not look very good right now. We had torrential rain this morning. We got an unbelievable amount of rain in a really short amount of time. So these lettuce seedlings definitely took a beating. I am hopeful that they will survive. I think they probably will. So I'm not 100% sure if that lettuce will make it or not, but if it doesn't, I'm gonna go ahead and plant more seeds out here, and I should get some more lettuce to germinate pretty quickly. Now, lettuce is a great fall crop, especially if you pay attention to the variety that you're growing. There are many types of lettuce that are cold tolerant lettuces, and that's what I planted out here. I planted several types that are all considered winter lettuces. those will be able to grow really well and even thrive in cooler weather. So the idea is that even when we get a light frost, this lettuce should continue on. And actually, fall grown lettuce can be incredibly sweet. When it matures in that cool weather, it gives it a much sweeter flavor than when it matures in the heat of summer. So as I said, I'll be keeping an eye on these lettuce seedlings. While I think some of the individual leaves were damaged, I'm hopeful that the roots are still doing well and that they will produce. Now, it's unfortunate, they're so tiny, so it's unfortunate we had such a heavy rain at this stage in their lives, but I'm hopeful that they'll recover. And if not, I do have time to replant more lettuce. Here you can see a couple tiny cucumber plants next to this mature cucumber plant, which, as you can see, this is doing really well. It's got some cucumbers on it that are ready to harvest. So those cucumbers are, again, another crop that I'm not really growing so much for fall as I am going to try to get a second wave of summer harvest out of. Now, the existing cucumbers, the mature cucumbers that I have growing, will probably not yield all the way up until frost for me. But by starting a second crop of cucumbers, and that is a very quick maturing variety, I should most likely be able to get a second harvest of cucumbers right before our fall frost. Now, as I've been talking about maturity dates with all these plants, one thing you do have to keep in mind is that when you find the estimated maturity date for a plant, that's something that you'll often see in the seed catalog, the website, or the seed packet. Or if you just have seeds that you are gifted that don't come in a seed packet, you should be able to search online for the plant variety, and they should estimate the days to maturity for you. The problem with that is that those days to maturity are usually calculated or estimated based on ideal growing conditions. This time of year, at least in my area, the days are starting to shorten. We don't have as much daylight, which can definitely extend the amount of time that these plants take to mature. So these cucumbers that I planted, I want to say those are about a 55-day variety. Those may end up taking 65, maybe even 75 days to mature. Now, I have estimated probably about 60 days till my first frost, but I did start these cucumbers a little while ago, so those have already been going for a couple weeks. So depending on exactly when our first frost ends up being this fall, I should get at least a small yield from these cucumbers right before frost, which will give us a little bit more fresh produce a little later in the year. So here is yet another second wave planting that I have going on. These are potatoes. So a few weeks ago, we harvested all of my summer potatoes together, and that freed up, I think I only showed you guys harvesting the potatoes in the garden bed, but I did also harvest a bunch of potatoes from these pots here. Now that freed up this growing space for a second crop of potatoes. I did have some potatoes that I had purchased just for eating that had sprouted. So because they'd already sprouted, that gave me a little bit of a head start, and I was able to throw some potatoes into these pots here. Now, I'm not 100% sure what variety these potatoes are. I'm not 100% sure on the maturity date, but I decided to give it a try. Potatoes, like a lot of the other crops we talked about, can withstand a slight frost, especially because the tubers themselves are growing under the ground. They'll be insulated a little bit. So the hope is that these potatoes will mature quickly enough that I'll be able to get a harvest right before frost, or possibly right after frost. Worst case scenario, if our weather cools off a lot, because these are in pots, I can bring them into my house just to finish up, for the last week or two before the potatoes are mature. I am hoping I don't have to do that because I don't really want to have to make space in my house for these large potato pots. But either way, we should be able to get at least something from these potatoes. Now, this crop, admittedly, isn't something that I planted for fall, but these raspberries that we have growing here are what's called an ever-bearing raspberry variety, and that means that these will yield twice every year. As you can see, these bumblebees are busy pollinating my second crop of raspberries, and hopefully we'll get a nice good yield out of these. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me in the garden today, just walking through the garden and taking a look at the fall crops and the plans that we have for fall. Now, as I said, a lot of this is experimental. I don't really know what type of yield to expect for fall, but I'm hopeful, as you kind of always have to be as a gardener. So we do what we can, and then we hope for the weather to cooperate. Despite myself, I am starting to enjoy the cooler weather and just that little feeling of fall in the air. And I know I will definitely enjoy harvesting these fall crops, assuming that they do produce for us. So definitely check back and see how this fall garden does for us. I know I am hoping for the best. I hope that you have a fall garden going, and I hope that you're hopeful for a good harvest as well. So thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope that you are having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.